Welcome to the You Can Hack It workshop by Top Stitch Makers and Jerry in Stitches. In this tutorial, we're going to hack the essential shirt sewing pattern into a playsuit or romper. The first part of the tutorial will show how to modify the paper pattern, and the second part will show sewing order and construction. This summer playsuit will feature a neckline finish with a bias binding trim. I'll show you how to sew a button loop closure which secures a large opening in the back. You can choose to close the back opening with a zipper or another kind of closure, but I prefer a breezy, easy version with a button loop closure. The armholes are also finished with bias binding, and I'll show you how to install mine with a 1/2 inch trim. In addition, this tutorial will cover how to draft and sew inseam pockets that have a cutout detail. The playsuit also has an elasticated waistband that connects the bodice and pant pieces together. Making a mock-up or a muslin of the essential shirt in your size is crucial if you want to modify it. Then on your mock-up, mark where your waistline is on the vertical center line and transfer this to your paper pattern. Note your full hip measurement and also the vertical distance between your waistline and your hip, and this can be another useful reference point. Mine is 4 inches and it'll help determine the hip line on my paper patterns as well. We are going to use another pattern of your choice to convert this shirt into a playsuit or jumpsuit. So you can find one in your pattern stash for this sewing pattern mashup. I chose a free sewing pattern by Peppermint Magazine called the Peppermint Playsuit, and I've added the link in the description box below. I've made a version of it already so that I know I like the fit of the shorts section on my body. If you've chosen to use a playsuit pattern similar to this, the first thing to do is to determine the waistline on this pattern. So transfer this vertical measurement from neckline to waist onto the front and back and reflect this back on your paper pattern. If you don't have a playsuit pattern to work with, you can also choose an elasticated pant pattern for this hack. The most ideal pattern is one that is high-waisted so that you already know that the pants start on your waistline. If you're working with a pants pattern that begins somewhere lower than your waist, then you would need to add more height to the front and back crotch depth to combine it to the bodice section. Whichever pants or playsuit pattern you use, make sure you know how it fits your body beforehand by making a muslin for a good mashup starting point. Now, this is my mock-up after I've done the mashup, and I wanted to illustrate two main concerns when drafting for a playsuit. First, the bodice section is combined with the pants section, and the only way to put the garment on is to step into it like you're wearing a pair of pants. This means that the neckline opening has to be wide enough for your hips to fit through comfortably as well. That is why the playsuit I made has a large back opening. And one of the challenges is to figure out in advance what kind of opening you want in order to accommodate a large enough neckline opening for your hips to fit through. And I like a closure which is easy to handle so that it is convenient to undo it when I go to the bathroom. The second concern is to make sure that there is enough room drafted into the pattern so that when you raise your arms, you won't get an unpleasant wedgie. This room can be drafted in by adding to the crotch depth and or dropping the waistline of the bodice. The original waistline of the bodice is actually at this level marked by the black line, and I had to drop the waistline 2 more inches down for the mock-up before it connects to the elasticated waistband. A quick check by raising the arms reveals that I should drop the waistline down a little more. So an additional 1/2 inch drop for the final version did the trick. When I raise my arms now, the pants section of the playsuit doesn't move up and create a wedgie. So here's one last measurement to keep in mind before we start drafting the playsuit. Get the circumference measurement of the fullest part of your hips, then add at least 4 to 5 inches to this circumference. This would provide the required ease for the playsuit to be pulled comfortably up and down past the hips. All this ease will be cinched in at the waist with the elastic waistband. For example, my hip measurement is 36 inches and I added 4 more so that the total measurement is 40 inches. Then I divide this hip+Ease measurement by 4, which gives me the quarter hip+Ease measurement, which is 10. Jot this measurement down for drafting the pieces of the playsuit. To begin, we need the front and back of the essential shirt pattern and also the front and back of the playsuit pattern or your choice of pant pattern. Now we have to work with the versions of all these pattern pieces without seam allowances included. So I've gone ahead and traced out these versions without seam allowances, and in these versions also mark where your waistline and hip line occur on the paper patterns as important reference points for drafting. Let's start by drafting the front bodice of the playsuit using the essential shirt pattern with no seam allowances included. Secure some translucent drafting paper on top of this and we can start modifying the pattern. First, trace out the center front line. Then I trace out both back and front necklines. Technically speaking, I only need the front neckline for the front bodice, but I'm tracing out the back neckline here as well for easy drafting of the back bodice later. Always draw in the grain line for all of your patterns, and that's what you see me doing here. Then I go ahead and mark the original waistline of the bodice. Now, remember how I have to drop the waistline to prevent a wedgie problem? So I am now measuring 2.5 inches down from the original waistline, and then I pencil in a parallel line to it. This will be the level of my new waistline. Next, on this new waistline, from the center front line, measure the distance of the quarter hip plus ease measurement that we recorded from before. Mine is 10 inches. See how this marking is about a quarter inch from the original side seam line? Use this point to draft in the new side seam. For me, I am angling the ruler in a way that it will just meet with the original side seam line when it moves closer to the armhole. Now we have to adjust the new waistline to move in a gentle curve from side seam to center front. To do this, measure about a quarter inch up from this line, and at this point, draw in a half-inch perpendicular line to the side seam. Then using a French curve, connect this half-inch line to gradually meet with the rest of the new waistline. Doing this will help connect the front and back bodice in a smooth transition with no awkward angles while sewing. Double check that this curved waistline still measures the same for your quarter hip plus ease measurement, then we're good to go. Next, let's trace the shoulder seam line. I am drafting in shorter grown-in sleeves, so the shoulder seam is shorter than the original. This is an optional drafting step, so you can keep the original shoulder and armhole lines if you prefer. For me, I measure 3.5 inches from the end of the shoulder and mark this new end point for the shoulder seam. Then I draw in the half-inch perpendicular line to the shoulder seam, then use a French curve to draw in the armhole. The original underarm point is a little bit too far from the side seam in relationship to the shoulder, so I am adjusting this to bring it closer and a little bit lower than the original underarm point. Then I draw in the half-inch perpendicular line to the armhole. Next, I complete the side seam by eyeballing the curve to connect armhole to side seam. Now, after this is done, we've basically drawn in all the seam lines of the front bodice. So what's left is to add back in the seam allowances. There is no seam allowance on the center front since it is cut on the fold. The waist will be connected to a waistband, and I'm using a 5/8 inch seam allowance for this. The same goes for the side seam. Now you have to make decisions about how you want to close up the armholes. I am using a bias binding trim that requires a quarter inch seam allowance at these openings. The shoulder seam has a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And finally, for the neckline, I am using the same bias trim as the armholes, so that would be a quarter inch seam allowance as well. That's it. The front bodice is complete. Label it properly for future reference, and for the Playsuit hack, we will need one pattern piece cut on the fold from fabric. Before cutting out the paper pattern, we will use the front bodice to draft out the back bodice. To do so, you have to flip the front bodice over. I simply folded my drafting paper and flipped it over, so I am now ready to start drafting the back bodice. The cool thing about the essential shirt sewing pattern is that the back bodice shares many seam lines that are similar to the front bodice. The main difference between the two is at the neckline. And since I already added this back neckline while drafting the front bodice earlier, I simply just trace it out here now. All the other seam lines just need to be traced from the front bodice. I've already traced the center back line and the grain line, and now I do the same for the waistline, side seam, shoulder seam, and armhole. And now it's time to add back the seam allowances, which are the same for all seams except for the center back seam where the back opening will be. And I forgot to trace the original waistline onto the pattern, so I'm quickly adding that in now. For the center back seam, I'm adding 1 inch for the seam allowance. This seam allowance will allow for a double fold as the seam finish for the back opening. I draw in the fold lines, one at 3/8 inch from the edge of the 1 inch seam allowance. And the other fold line is the actual center back line. The final thing to add here is the notch where the back opening ends. Mine is 11 inches down from the back neckline. From this point down towards the waistline, this seam will be sewn closed, and that's it. The back bodice is done when labeled properly, and we will need to cut 2 pieces from our fabric. The front and back are done now, and the paper patterns can be cut out. We will be using the front bodice pattern to help draft the front pant pattern. Here we go. I have in front of me here the front of the Peppermint Magazine Playsuit pattern with no seam allowances included. Where my waistline hits on the pattern is drawn in red, and you can go ahead and do that if you haven't done so already. If you're using a pant pattern, then lay it out this way as well, and for the Playsuit, we're just going to use the bottom half of the pattern from the waist down. First, I am going to draw in the level of where the elasticated waistband would end. This is 1 1/4 inch down from the waistline to accommodate a 1 1/4 inch wide waistband. Align the waist seam line of your front bodice at the center front with this waistband level, making sure that the center front of the bodice is in line with the center front of the front playsuit. Tape it down securely so that it doesn't shift. The main adjustment I have to make here is to shift the side seam of the playsuit front pant so that it would match up with the front bodice. Place another piece of drafting paper on top of these 2 patterns and tape it down in order to draft the front pant pattern. Trace the waistband line, the crotch curve, the inseam, and the hem, making sure to transfer the notches as you go along. I also draw in the hip line, which for me is about 3 inches down from the waistband line, just in case I need it as a reference point. To draw in the side seam, I want to follow the side seam curve of the playsuit, starting from the hem, then shift it slightly till it meets the side seam of the bodice, the front bodice. When I am happy with the side seam curve, then I darken the lines, and now it's time to draw in a gentle curve for the waistline of the front pant. First, draw a 1/2 inch perpendicular line to the side seam at the level of the waistband. Then on the center front, drop the waistband level down 1/4 inch. And at that point, draw the 1/2 inch perpendicular line to the center front line. With a French curve, create a gentle curve combining these 2 1/2 inch lines together. The seam lines of the front pant are all drawn in now, and what's left to do is to add back in seam allowances. Mine are 5/8 of an inch at the waist, side seam, crotch, and inseam. The hem allowance is 1 7/8 inch wide. 3/8 inch of that is going to create the first fold, and the other 1.5 inch would be left for the width of the hem fold. For the pocket opening at the side seam, I measure 1 3/8 inches down from the waistband line for the start of the opening. Make another mark 6 inches below that for the width of the pocket opening. I draw 1/2 inch perpendicular lines to the side seam, then combine these 2 lines together to indicate the cutout detail on the inseam pockets. I draft the pocket pattern now directly on the front pant pattern so that I make sure that it'll fit properly. Make sure the pocket pattern starts from the front waistband level and it's large enough to fit the size of your hand. I'm basically just eyeballing it here when I'm doing this, and I make sure that when drawing in the shape of the pocket, I'm also including 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around the curve. From this, you would be able to draft the pocket pattern on another piece of drafting paper by tracing the lines. Here I have seam lines drawn in as well, and don't forget to draw in the grain line, which is a parallel line to the grain line of the front pant pattern. Transfer the cutout detail onto the pocket pattern and add 2 notches on the curves of the pocket for easy alignment during sewing. And the pocket pattern is done. So is the front pant. Label it and cut out 2 of these on your fabric. Oh, and one last detail. Let's put in the right seam allowance at the inseam. Fold the paper at the hem line and trace out the inseam and the seam allowance lines where the hem fold is. This will provide enough fabric to sew the hem down properly when sewing. So keep the front pant pattern close because we'll need it to help draft the back pant. I've taped down my back playsuit pattern down, and the main challenge here is to create gentler curves at the crotch and side seams to match the boxy shape of the essential shirt pattern. First, I draw a perpendicular line to the waistline close to the crotch curve as a guide. Somewhere between this straight line and the original curve, I am drawing in a gentler curve with the help of a French curve. This will be my new crotch curve. Where the crotch curve now meets the waistband line, which is 1 1/4 inch lower than the waistline, I measure the quarter hip and ease measurement from the center back to the side seam. This point here where my pencil is should be where my side seam should start. Now we're going to use the side seam curve that is drawn for the front pant pattern and transfer that to the back pant. To do this, flip the front pant over so that the reverse side is facing up. Then match the starting points of the side seams between front and back pant patterns. Also make sure that the hem lines align between the front pant and the back playsuit pattern at this point in time. Then using chalk paper and a tracing wheel, trace out the side seam curve onto the drafting paper of the back playsuit. Transfer pocket opening notches, then darken the lines. Now place another piece of drafting paper on top of these 2 patterns and secure with tape to prevent shifting. Trace out the hem line, the grain line, the hip line, and the side seam. Pencil in the level of the waistband line. Measure the waistband line from center back to side seam and make sure that it is your 1/4 hip and ease measurement. Now measure 3/8 of an inch up from the waistband line at center back and draw in a 1/2 inch perpendicular line to the center back line. Draw another 1/2 inch perpendicular line to the side seam. Then using a French curve, join these 2 1/2 inch lines from one end to the other, drafting a gentle curve from center back to side seam for the new waistline of the back pant. Trace out the crotch curve and the inseam, and I'm going to go ahead and darken the new waistline curve and also add the cutout detail of the inseam pocket. Now we can add seam allowances back in. The hem allowance is 1 7/8 inch wide, and all other seam allowances are 5/8 of an inch wide. Remember to transfer all notches as well and label your pattern. We will cut 2 back playsuit pant pieces on fabric. Do a quick double check that the side seams and inseams match up nicely between the front and back pant patterns and that the quarter hip and ease measurement is accurate. Just like what we did for the front pant, let's make sure that the seam allowances are going to match up properly at the hem fold. We are making a fold on the hemline, then tracing out the lines of the inseam and its seam allowance on the hem fold. And with that, the back pant pattern of the playsuit is done. The last pattern to draft is the waistband, and this is basically a long rectangle. I've drafted mine to go all the way around my waist, so the length of it is my hip+Ease measurement, and the width of the waistband is 1 and 1/4 inch to have enough room to fit a 1 inch wide elastic band. If this makes a pattern that can't fit into your fabric because of the length of it, you can also draft this with a fold line at center front, which means that the length of the waistband pattern will be half the hip and ease measurement that you have. Draft in notches where the side seams will go. Add seam allowance all the way around, and we will need to cut two of these on the center front fold line. So here's a quick review of the pattern pieces that we've drafted. Here's the front bodice, cut one on the fold. The back bodice needs two fabric pieces cut as a mirrored pair. We also need two fabric pieces cut as a mirrored pair for the front pant and the back pant. Here's the pocket pattern, and we need four pieces cut, which is also two mirrored pairs. And we need two waistband fabric pieces, either cut full length or on the fold, depending on how you've drafted your waistband pattern. Sewing construction begins with stay stitching the front and back necklines. Remember to stitch from shoulder seam to center for both front and back necklines. Then we're going to attach the back bodices together at the center back seam. To do so, fold at the first fold line from the raw edge. The fold is turned towards the wrong side and pressed. Put the right sides of the back bodices together, pin and sew from the opening notch down towards the waistline. Press open the seam, then edge stitch the seams of the back opening down, connecting the seam to the bodice fabric. When that is done, you can catch stitch the rest of the seams down from the back opening notch to the waistline. We would also need to cut out some bias binding. Cut one strip from your dress fabric, measuring at least 6 inches long. This is for the button loop closure, and the width should at least be 1 inch wide. Then we would also need enough length of bias binding to finish the neckline and armholes. If you want to try out this trim method that I will be offering, then start off with bias binding that is 2 inches wide. So let's make the button loops. For a shank button that is about 3/8 of an inch wide, we would need to make 2-inch long button loops that are as skinny as possible. Here's how I do it. Start with a strip of bias folded lengthwise in half with right sides facing. I line up the folded edge with the right side of the presser foot when I'm at the machine, and sew the first set of stabilizing stitches at a 1/4 inch from the folded edge. Then it's easier and more accurate to sew the 1/8 inch channel for the loops. Also, I use a narrow zigzag stitch that gives some room for the bias to stretch. Now I cut off the excess using the first set of stitches as a cutting guide. Turn out the fabric with a loop turner, insert the loop turner into the channel all the way, then pierce the fabric with the movable teeny arm so that it locks securely into place. It may take a few tries to get the first turn going at the tip, but once it goes through, everything else follows very smoothly. When it's completely turned out, press the strap carefully with an iron. This is also the same method for making spaghetti straps, but for button loops cut into 2 inches long for each, and then they're ready to be installed into the garment. Fold each 2-inch section into half and position it on the wrong side of the back bodice, just below the seam allowance line. So when we sew on the bias binding trim later, the trim will cover up the ends of the button loop. I am installing this on the right back bodice, and you want to leave enough loop sticking out from the center back fold line so that the button can be moved through it. Pin and sew the button loop down at the sewing machine. Do a final check that the button loop closure works, and we can now connect front and back bodices together by sewing the shoulder and side seams with wrong sides facing. I am using French seams, but you can choose whichever seam finish you want to close up the raw edges. Sew and press these seams, and we can move on to installing the bias binding trim for the armholes. This is what it looks like when the trim is installed, and of course you can go ahead and apply your preferred way of closing the openings with bias, but here's how I did mine. First, we need to create two folds along the length of the bias. Fold the first fold 3/8 of an inch from one of the raw edges. Wrong sides are facing. The second fold is made by aligning the other raw edge with the fold that we just made. The resulting width of the folded bias will be around 3/4 of an inch wide. Press both these folds and start with one end of the bias cut on the straight grain of the fabric. This means that the end is cut at a 45-degree angle to the length of the bias. Then draw in a 1/4 inch seam line on the wrong side of the bias. Where the seam line meets the 3/8 inch fold line, mark its position and transfer the marking onto the right side of the bias as well. This will be the starting point of one end of the bias. Next, pin the folded bias to the armhole. Right sides are facing, and align the side of the bias that has the raw edge with the raw edge of the armhole. Pin all the way around to get the accurate length of the bias required. Overlap the two ends of the bias when you've come all the way around and make a marking on the other end of the bias to coincide with the starting point that you made from before. Now unpin the bias so that we can sew the bias in the round in order to fit the circumference of the armhole. Find the marking that we just made and transfer that to the wrong side of the bias. And use this point as a guide to draw in the 45-degree angle to the length of the bias. Make sure that this 45-degree angle is angled in the same direction as the starting end of the bias. Draw in the 45-degree angle for the seam line. Add in a 1/4 inch seam allowance, then you can cut out the length of bias required. With right sides facing, sew the two ends of bias together with the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Trim off the excess seam allowance and press the folds again if required. Now that the bias is sewn in the round, we can repin it to the armhole. This time, pin it so that the raw edge of the bias is sandwiched between the raw edge of the fabric and the folded edge of the bias. In addition, make sure that the seams of the bias do not overlap with the seams of the side and shoulder seams of the bodice to reduce bulk in those areas. We can sew this at the machine now at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the armhole circumference. You can see that when we flip the bias trim under, there will be about a 1/2 inch trim extending from the armhole seam line. What's next is to trim off the excess seam allowance in the raw edge of the bias and the dress fabric in order to reduce bulk. Press at the armhole seam line and we can top stitch a 1/4 inch away from the seam line, catching the folded edge of the bias beneath. When it's done, you would have created a neat trim for your armhole. Repeat this for the other armhole, then we can move on to installing the trim for the neckline. The tricky thing here is that we have to deal with the bias when the ends are cut on the bias, which means that it will have a tendency to expand at the cut ends because of its stretchiness. That is why we have to make triangular snips where the fold lines are for the cut ends of the bias to sit neatly aligned with the center back fold line. This prevents the ends from expanding. Pin the start of the bias to the neckline. Right sides are together and the raw edge of the bias is sandwiched between the raw edge of the neckline and the folded edge of the bias. Bring this to the machine and sew at 3/8 inch seam allowance. When you come to the other end of the neckline, stop sewing at about 2 inches before you reach the center back. Mark where the bias tape will have to end and add 3/8 inch seam allowance. Cut off the length required for the bias, then make triangular snips at the fold lines. Fold on the fold lines again and align this with the neckline and center back. Double check the width of the bias and you may have to cut off more triangular snips to make this work. Pin and sew the rest of the bias to the neckline. Now cut off the excess seam allowance from the raw edges of the bias and the dress fabric. Do not cut into the folded edge of the bias. Flip the bias under, then press for a crisp seam. Now I add another button loop by slipping the ends of the loop inside the folds of the bias created at the center back. When we top stitch the bias to the dress fabric around the neckline, we will also secure these button loops down with double rows of stitching. Before taking this to the machine, I recommend hand basting the bias to the neckline first, and I like to sew from the center front to center back. flip my work, and sew center front to back again to reduce puckering at the center front neckline. When the button loops are secured, we can hand sew the shank buttons, positioning them with the help of the button loops. Then at the back opening, sew a satin stitch with zigzag stitches in order to strengthen this joint here that would receive quite a bit of stress when we step in and out of the garment. We are now ready to sew the waistband onto the bodice. Decide which of the two will be the outer waistband and which would be the inner waistband. For the inner waistband, on the bottom long edge, fold a half inch towards the wrong side of the waistband. Pre-press this half-inch fold at the ironing station. Then connect the two ends of the waistbands together at the center back seam. Press the seam open. With right sides together, pin the outer waistband to the bodice, matching the center back seams and the notches to the side seams and center front. Sew at the 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. Next, pin the right side of the inner waistband to the wrong side of the bodice. Sew at the same 5/8 inch seam allowance that you did for the outer waistband. At the ironing station, press the waistbands down away from the bodice, grate the seams, and we're ready to sew up the pants section of the playsuit. The first thing to do is to install the inseam pockets. You will need one of the front pant and a pair of the pockets. The contrast fabric is for the cutout detail, so we will work with the one cut from dress fabric first. Make sure the lines of the cutout rectangle are transferred to the pocket on the wrong side, and then strengthen these cutout opening lines by applying fusible interfacing over them. Retrace these lines onto the interfacing. Pin this with right sides facing to the front pant and sew the three sides of this cutout rectangle. Next, draw in lines a 1/4 inch away from the stitch lines and then cut along these lines and snip diagonally towards the corners, being careful not to snip into the stitch lines. Flip the pocket piece over and understitch the pocket to the seam allowance on the long side of the cutout rectangle. Now we can bring this to the iron and flip the pocket under so that the wrong sides are facing. Press crisp lines to define the three sides of the cutout rectangle. Top stitch a 1/4 inch from the edge on all three sides. Next, we can attach the other pocket to this one. With the right sides together, sew all the way around the curves of the pocket and finish the seams. I used French seams here when attaching the pocket pieces together. This is a really cool cutout detail for inseam pockets, and you can now baste the pocket to the pant at the side seam and the waistline to secure these fabric layers before attaching the front pant to the back pant. We can now repeat this process for the other pant leg. To attach the front pant to the back pant, sew the side seams and the crotch seams with right sides together and finish the seams in your preferred method. I also hem up my pant leg at this point in time. I do so by pre-pressing the hem fold lines after I sew up the side seam and before I sew the crotch seam together. Pre-pressing makes it easier to hem the pants up because the fold lines are already pressed when the pant leg is already attached in the round. For the hem, I use a double fold. The first fold is at 3/8 of an inch from the raw edge, and the next fold is at 1 7/8 inch from the raw edge. Pin this fold to the pant and sew it down at the machine. Then we can repeat this for the other pant leg. When two pant legs are done, we can attach both at the crotch seam. Start with one pant leg turned inside out and insert the pant leg that has the right side facing outwards into the inside out pant leg. This brings the right sides of the pant legs facing together. Align the raw edges of the crotch and first pin where both inseams would meet, and keep pinning on just either the front or back crotch only, matching at the notches. Then I take this to the machine and sew 1/2 of the crotch seam first from the inseam to the waistline. This ensures that the crotch seam will match perfectly where it meets the inseam. Then I flip my work and pin from inseam to waistline again for the rest of the crotch seam. And of course, I'm making sure that I'm matching up the notches. Sew at the machine starting again from inseam to waistline. The crotch seam is a very long seam with curves, and if we sew this seam from waistline to waistline, the fabric might shift as we go and result in the cross point of inseam and crotch seam not matching perfectly. In order to sew the bodice to the pant section of the playsuit, turn the pant section inside out. The bodice, turned upside down and with the right side facing outwards, will then be inserted inside the pant section, and this positions the right sides of the fabric facing each other. Align the raw edge of the pants to the raw edge of the outer waistband. Move the inner waistband aside while doing this so as not to catch it in the stitching. Match the center front, back, and side seams to the corresponding notches, then sew at the machine with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, connecting only the outer waistband to the pants. Press the seam of the outer waistband directing downwards. Now you're viewing the garment when it's inside out. What needs to be done now is to fold down the inner waistband so that the folded edge of it overlaps the bottom edge of the outer waistband by about 1/8 of an inch. We're going to stitch the folded edge of the inner waistband by stitching it in the ditch. This means that the garment has to be turned to the right side, and we are pinning this 1/8 inch overlap of the inner waistband to the ditch of the bottom edge of the outer waistband. Pin all the way around, but leave markings at the center back to indicate a gap of at least 2 to 3 inches so that we can insert the elastic band into this gap later. Backstitch at the beginning and end of the stitch line when stitching this down in the ditch. To insert the elastic waistband into this elastic band channel that we just created, first make markings on the ends of the elastic to make sure that the elastic doesn't get twisted while it's inserted into the channel. Secure safety pins on both ends of the elastic to prevent losing them in the channel if pulled too vigorously. Start inserting the elastic into the channel through the gap and shift the elastic band through with the help of the safety pin. When pulled through completely, overlap the ends and attach with a safety pin. It's time to do a fitting to check and see if this length of elastic fits you properly. If not, make the necessary adjustments, and when you have the desired length, pin both ends together and connect the ends of the elastic with zigzag stitches. Cut off any excess elastic, then close up the gap at the center back by stitching it in the ditch at the bottom edge of the outer waistband. To prevent the elastic tape from shifting in the channel, you can sew additional stitch lines at the side and center seams across the width of the waistband. Make sure you position the gathers made by the elastic evenly before you do so, and believe it or not, your Playsuit hack of the essential shirt pattern is complete! The drafting skills that I've shared here can be applied whenever you want to combine a top to a pair of bottoms in order to make a one piece like a jumpsuit or a playsuit. In this tutorial, I shared how I finished neckline and armhole openings with a bias binding trim, a way to sew inseam pockets with a cutout contrast detail, and how to sew button loops. All these elements come together to create a summer playsuit or romper of your dreams. It's been lots of fun sharing with you the process of making this garment, and I hope you use these tips and techniques for your future sewing projects. If you do, please share your makes on social media and tag me so that I can celebrate your makes with you. Thanks so much and happy sewing!